So here's very quickly what we're going to talk about. As you know, this is a subject I really enjoy, and we could talk on for days, I'm sure. We're going to talk a little bit about the canine-human bond, the significance of dogs for evolutionary theory, extensive variation, the role of selection, the limitations on variation. So we're going to talk about various things, the rate of change, mosaic evolution in anatomy and behavior. We're going to talk about canine origins and evolution, human-canine coevolution, elements of human-canine coevolution, morphological, which is to say anatomical, behavioral, and the idea that there may have been multiple independent domestication events. And then we're going to talk about something hypothetical is maybe even too heavy of a word, but a scenario, something speculative, involving the Pyrenees, which is where my dogs come from, the Cro-Magnon people, and various lines of evidence, archaeological, genetic, linguistic, that might support some interesting ideas. But to go back a little bit, in 479 BC, in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians had to abandon Athens. They took all their women and children and old folks, put them in another town, came back, tried to hold it, but ultimately had to retreat down to the Piraeus, onto boats, and gone. The dogs, of course, were always with them, and there wasn't room for them on the boats. So even 500 years later, Plutarch is describing the heartbreak of the dogs running up and down the shore, trying to get into the waves, going back. Xanthippus was among the fellows on the boat. He's the father of Pericles. His dog plunged into the surf, made it out, swam alongside the boat all the way to Salamis, a distance of 12 miles next to the boat. They got there, Xanthippus jumped off the boat, ran over, dog comes out of the water, pulls himself up on shore, and dies. They created a funeral mound like they would for a person and named the spot Dog Burial Mound for that dog. It's still called that as far as I know. 2,500 years later, in 1924, this fellow here is Hachiko. He's an Akita. And he belonged to a professor at the University of Tokyo named Dr. Uena. When he got the puppy, he had him with him all the time. When he would go to the university, the pup would walk out, stand by the door. The fellow went to the train station. When he came back at 4 o'clock, dog would be waiting on the platform. He did that every day, but one day, Dr. Uena died at the university. He never came home in the train. Hachi was standing on the platform, 4 o'clock, searching the faces, looking for his friend who never came. He went there at 4 o'clock to that platform every day for the next 10 years, looking for him. Eventually, the station master made him a bed there, fed him. This statue here was erected in his honor, actually before he even died. It was so touching to people. This is Chaser and Dr. John Pilley, whom his students call Merlin, of Wofford College. He got Chaser as a retirement project. He had heard there was a dog who could identify 200 different objects, and he decided to try his hand. All of this mound of toys, if you see at the top there, is Chaser. He can identify every single one of those toys. He can put his foot on it, or he can retrieve it, or he can push it with his nose. So he has a vocabulary of actually 1,022 toy names. He can sort them by category. If you say, bring me a ball, he'll bring one of the balls. Or bring me a specific ball, he'll bring that ball. Also frisbees, cloth toys, etc. He can interact with them various ways. He's now beginning to learn grammar. That's Pilley's second retirement project. He's just turned 80, so he's going to work on that. And he can infer the names of new toys. So he was on the TV show with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who introduced a new toy into the stack. And he said, go find it, or maybe Pilley said. And the dog didn't know, he doesn't know this toy's name. Kind of looks, comes back, and says, go find it. The second time, he found it. It was Darwin. Go find Darwin. So. So those are the sorts of things that we want to explain. Those kinds of behaviors are not common in the animal world. In fact, the people themselves in the experiment don't remember all the names. They have to look at the tag they're all tagged with so that they don't tell him wrong. So, but evolutionary biologists have different reasons for liking dogs, for finding them fascinating, in addition to the ones that everybody has, or nearly everybody. And that is that dogs help us investigate open questions in evolutionary biology. Open questions are the things that drive every science. And in evolutionary biology, these are not always well understood by the public, but they're very compelling to people inside the field. So they include things like the ability of natural selection to build adaptations, and in the case of the dog, artificial selection, breeding, selective breeding by people to build adaptations. Various things that affect the processes, patterns, and speed of change. The extent of variation in populations, which is something a lot of folks don't think about, but that's a very, very important issue. Because the kind of variation that you see within populations will in general lead to the kind of variations you see among species. So we have all these hummingbirds, we have all these bats, variations, yeah, they're pretty cool. These pictures are from Haeckel's Kunstformen der Natur, art forms in nature. And like I say, limitations on variation, very important, okay? It's cool what natural selection can do, what adaptations can do, but it's also very interesting, the limits. What ways can natural selection work? What things can it create? What things does it have trouble with? So here is a hound from 2000 BC. It's an Egyptian wall painting. Here is a similar hound from 1500 AD. And here is a similar hound from today. Strikingly similar. This phenotype, right, this look of an animal seems to be pretty much static, and it's very distinctive. It suggests that in this case, if you're looking for this type of body, it's a minimal role for selection, right? All you have to do is kind of keep it. You don't have to constantly create it. And this is involved with something we call developmental constraint. Right, so that there aren't a lot of options, there are just a few for selection to act on. Even when miniaturized, this form keeps the same features. These dogs weigh 10 pounds at the most. So, and you can see them throughout the centuries looking very much the same. Not to belittle humans, but no breeder, however talented, could possibly maintain that if variation were equally in all directions, right? There's a thing that you stick on. So other open questions in evolutionary theory, the importance of regulatory genes in the expression of traits, right? So some genes turn on and off other genes. In the case of the bulldog here, there's just one mutation that creates that face, that look for the bulldog. It keeps the bone from being laid down in the usual way. And so that's why they have this, what's called brachycephalic or chondroplastic anatomy. And it's not just bulldogs, but all of these brachycephalic breeds have this. You can see this porcelain from 1760, this pug from a couple years ago. Another static type is the Spitz type. This is a chow from the Han Dynasty. A Norwegian elk hound living today, a Greenland dog from a few hundred years ago. Right? The tail curved over the back, the pointy nose, the ears up but slightly out. Another open question is correlations of growth, or what's called allometry. So smaller dogs tend to have shorter legs with respect to the entire dog, rounder heads. As they get larger bodied, the legs and muzzle get longer disproportionately to the rest of the anatomy. And this is of interest not just because dogs are interesting, but because you find allometric relationships throughout nature. So this is the kiwi. Kiwi is a dwarf bird, so as the body got smaller, it did that at one rate. The egg doesn't get smaller at the same rate, so you ended up with a bird with an egg that's a third of its body size by the time they lay it. Right? So allometric proportions matter a lot in evolutionary biology. Mosaic evolution, similar to allometry. Some parts can change a little bit while others change a lot. And then there's relationships between anatomical characteristics and behavioral changes. So one element of these is called heterochrony, or changes in the timing of developmental events. Specifically, one of interest to us is neoteny, or holding on to youth, the retention of juvenile features in the adult stages of the descendant. So here we have these famous little foxes, if you're familiar with the Russian domestication project. Over a series of a few decades, they took foxes that were friendly ones and bred them together. And the more they did, the shorter the foxes' faces did, the more puppy-like they came to look, even just by selecting for the behavior. Again, this is interesting not only because of dogs and foxes, but because of other species. And one of my favorite examples of neoteny would be humans. Our ape relatives have babies with high domed heads, flat faces. They sit fairly high over their back. As they grow, the muzzle elongates and you get this very different look. We don't go as far. So we retain juvenile characteristics of our ancestors in our grown form. We have a whole bunch of other adaptations as well, of course. Things having to do with altruism, group selection, humans and dogs living together, benefiting both, similar to how you have wildebeest and zebras living together communally. Why can you get this outside of a family situation when you're cooperating with organisms that are not your kin, not even in this case your own species?
In the fox study, they became much more aggressive too.
No, they became less aggressive.
Well, but then there were ones that became very aggressive. And what I'm trying to figure out as far as what relationship does the physicalness have to the behavior, whether it was more or less aggressive?
Yeah, so I don't think that it tracks one-to-one at all. I think there's a lot of room in there. But a lot of the foxes ended up very, very friendly with people. And when they were breeding from those foxes, the friendlier ones, some of the things seemed to come along for the ride. More playful behavior, the shorter muzzle, the rounder head. They were yipping into adulthood, so barking like dogs rather than adult foxes tend not to do that. Right? You developed all kinds of variation, right? Coat color variation. This one has blue eyes. Lots of things that you don't see in the silver fox in nature. And so it disrupted the sort of fox's way of being, right? A lot of things that would have been perhaps selected out in nature were allowed to come to the surface.
For the behavior that they wanted, for example, are somehow triggered the physical things too. There's some relationship somewhere.
Yeah, well, it's a system. It's a developmental system. And when they were looking for essentially more outgoing behavior, more puppy-like behavior, and the easiest way to get that, I think, the way they ended up doing it, even unknowing, is to move toward neoteny, toward the retention of a lot of juvenile traits in the adult.
Well, two things. First, just on this particular study, a show called Radio Lab, which comes out of New York Public Radio and is a podcast, has a discussion of this whole fox study. But secondly, it seems that dogs, or maybe it's just because we interfere with them so much, they change pretty rapidly.
Yeah, well, dogs have the largest range of variation we see in any organism. And so that you can see it, right? Just go to a dog show, you'll see it. What strikes me is that it's not just in all directions, that you do have these kind of types that it settles into. The greyhound type, the Spitz type, right? The brachycephalic type. In the mid-1700s, Linnaeus wrote a tract on dogs, which I have been working on translating. Actually, my Latin's not very good, but he has 10 different types, and they're largely the types we have today. So there's an interaction between having a great deal of variation, but it's not just willy-nilly. There are set up within the genome ways in which this can be expressed, which geneticists are just starting to get a handle on.
Since human beings have interfered with certain dogs, like the pug and the bulldog and so forth, if hypothetically we decided to, because they're not necessarily benefiting themselves from these characteristics, they can't breathe, the mothers have trouble giving birth to these large-headed animals. Hypothetically, if we decided to return them to what was their nature, would that process be faster because it's more, what they originally were created, whatever that means to be?
So dogs' natural niche is to be with us, right? And in a whole bunch of different forms. With the brachycephalic breeds, I don't know that they're any more unnatural than anything else. That's the kind of variation that arises. You hear a lot of things about them having trouble breathing, having trouble breeding, having trouble whelping, right? But these are often people who are trying to make a quick buck from these dogs. I know show breeders who are very concerned about health, who've had these Pekingese, for example. I have a friend, had these for 30 years, 40 years, right? They have free whelping Pekingese. The dogs are just fine. They live into their teens, they get around well. She's never had one that had a back problem. Everybody has some little health things, all of us, right? But these dogs are perfectly healthy. Unfortunately, you get a few cases and it gets blown out of proportion because there's dogs and how we interact with them have become so politically charged with the animal rights movement and things like that. And of course, extreme animal rights folks think that there should be no interaction between us and basically the rest of the animal world, right? And so every excuse they can, they grab it, anything, they throw it up in the press, this sort of thing. So, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. So where did they come from? You can see the base of this tree 90 million years ago, right? At this point, the primate lineage branched off from the line leading eventually to dogs. Around here, the cats branched off from dogs and bears. At this point, you have the bears and also walruses branching off, around 30 million. Here you have foxes and wolves splitting around 10, 12 million. It's a little more complicated than that, but we'll look at it this way. So carnivores arose from the Myacidae. This is Myasis. It's a bit like a possum in a way, a bit like a civet, but most people aren't too familiar with civets. So it lives in the trees and it eats little things, and a bit like a raccoon or a possum. It was a large family. It persisted from 60 to 40 million years ago. Oops. One of the things that it gave rise to is this Hesperocyon, which lived 40 to 30 million years ago, and which seems to be ancestral to this Tomarctus, which was quite dog or fox-like. It's shown in the picture here a little more dog-like than I think is really necessary. But anyway, it gave rise to the Cape hunting dog, jackals, wolves and foxes. I know you can't see this very well, but again, this is showing the split from genetic data, not just morphological. Here you have the split between bears and walruses, on the one hand, then the split between some foxes up here, the gray fox down here, and the rest of the dogs in the middle, dogs and some foxes. So fox is not a sort of natural group. Basically, it looks like, colloquially, things that are not dogs or wolves, we call foxes. But here's our guy right here. Here's the boxer with next to the wolf. So if you think of the wolf as a larger thing, not just the wolves we have living today, but a larger ancestral population that gave rise to modern wolves on the one hand, and all of the various dog breeds on the other. The genetic data at the moment is suggesting that the Asiatic breeds and the African breeds the genetics are more similar one to the other than the various European breeds. Again, that's kind of counterintuitive because you can find dogs, Spitz-type dogs in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and you might think that they would be closely related. But again, you're hitting on these types that emerge out of the genome of dogs. Another problem with this is that modern wolves and dogs are interfertile. So from time to time, you'll have wolf genes coming into the dog population, and that can really confuse things genetically. This picture's on the back of your program. They're getting very good data now, and getting dogs, this is genetically, to sort out at the breed level. So all of the Newfoundlands that they looked at sort out in one clump. You don't get Newfoundlands somewhere else, and you get other breeds inside there. So it's really amazing. This was not around 10 years ago. So anyway, the big question, right, how did this happen, right? So one scenario is, he followed me home. So wolf pups are very social. Wolf pack behavior is pretty stereotyped, right? Wolf puppies are supposed to stay at the den while the adults go out. Wolf puppies and children, if they were living in close proximity, may have ended up playing together. And it may have been beneficial to the humans because they distract the kids, right? And to the dogs because a lot of animals are afraid of humans, and so it gives some protection to the cubs just being near a human settlement. So that's one. On the opposite end of things, the idea that dogs may have been captured by early humans. They may have chained them out, basically, to sound the alarm if somebody else were coming, strangers, predators, whatever, something like that. To me, it might explain changes in morphology, but not necessarily the sorts of changes in behavior that we see reflected in the stories that I told at the beginning, right? You don't see this depth of response emotionally. So I think that's probably the least likely of them. Plus, it's a whole lot of work, right? To capture this thing, to keep it there, seems to me, that seems unlikely. Another scenario that's very attractive to a lot of people and has been for a long time is cooperative hunting. Wolves, of course, are cooperative social hunters, and early humans, and even currently living humans in many cases, hunt as groups, right, small groups. If they're hunting the same prey, they may have ended up cooperating, right? Wolves have a couple of different behaviors. They will hold much of the herd of what they're trying to get and single out one. So a few individuals will hold, a few individuals will chase down the one that they've singled out. This is similar to the sorts of things that work for humans. Since humans are not going to run something down like a cheetah runs down a gazelle, right? So some kind of way of holding the animals. So they could have interacted that way. Again, it doesn't quite explain why they would become so close in interaction. Why don't we just have dogs kind of at a distance, right? But it may have played a role. Scavenging is a popular scenario, right? Humans leave a lot of garbage, right? And a lot of it is still edible, especially by an organism that's not sensitive to the type of bacteria that we are, right? So a lot of dogs, even today, what are called pariah dogs, eke out an existence at the edge of garbage dumps and do just fine without interacting very much. So that may have played a role, right? There's the idea of self-domestication that's pretty popular. So it might be a matter of wolves hanging out around garbage or some other reason that the wolves are at the perimeter of human activity. And that might go directly to begging food from humans, or there might have been selection, again, in sort of a negative way, for wolves that could read human emotions. So it's one thing you can coax the wolf to try to give it some food, or it can beg, or if you've got people trying to drive the wolves off, anything that they can do, anything behaviorally as an appeasement gesture to humans might help them stay there. So there could be rapid selection for wolves that were scavenging and were able to avoid being run off because of being cute, basically, right? Looking, eye contact, right? Wolves, most wild animals, will not look you in the eye. Dogs will look you in the eye. They read your behaviors very closely. They seem to identify with emotional states, or at least they're able to read the emotional states and produce the correct response. I would say they don't know what they're doing, but that is a stereotype behavior that dogs have that's very successful with people and really crucial. And again, with the harkening back to the Russian fox example, neoteny might be a way morphologically of achieving that, right? The cute puppyish face, we have what's called a cute response, right? The more playful behavior, the wolves are not skulking around, they're more straightforward seeming. So that may have produced a very quick domestication in both behavior and appearance. And if that's the case, or some combination of those, because for the most part these are not mutually exclusive, then it makes sense that it doesn't have to be a one-time thing. It's the sort of thing that might happen here and there from time to time, perhaps even fairly often. And indeed, the genetic evidence, the archaeological evidence, and the geographic evidence all suggest that there have been multiple instances of domestication, possibly quite a number of them. So again, you'd say, well, then why do dogs look particular ways? Right? And I think there's a whole lot to know about how the genome is patterned that we don't know yet, and that some of it may have to do with developmental constraints, things like neoteny, this sort of thing. So with the idea of there being multiple domestication events, here's one example. This is a 7,000-year-old fossil dog from Siberia. This dog was buried in a human cemetery. It had a mammoth bone in its mouth, suggestive of food that it would need as it's passing into the afterlife. Right? It had its brain removed, which was the common burial technique for these people. It was done up exactly like a human being was, exactly like the other inhabitants of the graveyard were. And it had some of the grave goods in addition to this. So there were wooden spoons, there were various other things. Clearly, this dog was part of daily life. And unlike a number of other dog burials that are around, particularly you'll see some from South America, where the dog appears to have been put in as food for the person's journey, right? It was included as part of the burial of a human. This was a burial unto itself. Right? And it suggests that there were rights for dogs, similarly to humans, not that the likelihood that this is an isolated case is pretty low. So, but going back a little bit farther, right? All of the dogs that we have, the breeds living today that have been sequenced genetically, seem to trace back to a dog from the Middle East around this same period of time as this one, about 7,000 years ago, 7 to 15, because it depends on which individual breeds you use, but not more than 12 to 15. We're finding at around 30,000 years, 25 to 35,000 years, a lot of dogs cropping up in different areas across Europe at isolated places. So Siberia, Czech Republic, Belgium, dogs that are similar in type to the Spitz type dog, but also vary among themselves, so it doesn't look like these are necessarily descended one for the other. The folks, several of the folks that have done the archaeology on this have compared the dogs to this Greenland Eskimo dog. Shortened face compared to a wolf. You really wouldn't confuse that dog on the right with the wolf if you looked at it in any detail, right? Much shorter muzzle, more round head, rounder eyes. The ears, you can't quite see them here, but they're set off to the side a little bit. They're not right up on top of the head like a wolf would have. Here's a picture from the 18th century of a Greenland dog, and you can see very similar facial look to that. The body is more square, and it has the tail curled up over the back, whereas a wolf's tail is carried low, right? So you might think, oh, well, maybe this Greenland dog is descended from them, unlike certain other, Pekingese and our sort of normal breeds. But no, the genetics on this dog are like the other European breeds. This is a result of the domestication event, perhaps 10,000 years ago. Now this is a similar dog from Siberia that was found, it was published last year. It's a cave in the Altai Mountains. And the skull that they found of this particular dog, they compared to, this are the sort of ancestral wolves, so ancient wolves from the time. These, this are modern wolves here in the pink. So modern wolves are a little bit shortened muzzle compared to the ancestral wolves, but not a lot. These blue lines here represent two others of these domestications around 30,000 years. You can see they have, they're definitely different morphologically, but in some ways they go in the other direction, right? So you see a scattering of morphological traits here. Here in the green is the dog that was found in the Altai cave, and the black one is the current Greenland Eskimo dog. So very, very interesting. And again, the genetics really rule out that these are related. So domestication, the sort of first step, seems to be something along these lines, right? But in a little bit different ways, different times. And there are fossils a bit older than the last common ancestor of current breeds, around 15 to 20,000 years ago. And these are a bit smaller bodied. They're a bit less Spitz-like. They were probably yet more independent domestication events. Maybe they looked like those, maybe not. This overlaps with the time period of modern human beings called the Cro-Magnon people. Right. These are anatomically modern humans. Surely, if one were in here, he would understand the lecture just as well as we do, perhaps better. Their brains were actually a little bit bigger than present-day folks. But you can see the face points out a little bit more. The modern human is a little bit flatter there. And a little bit more rounded. The Cro-Magnon tend to be a little bit longer skulled. Compared to a Neanderthal here, you can see that looks like us. The Neanderthal looks quite different.
If you let your dog out at the wrong time, you will end up with mutts. And how is it that you have these specific breeds? Did people breed dogs all that time, or how does that happen?
So there are two things to think about in that in general. You have the kinds of morphologies that seem to emerge with domestication or with particular applications, right? The hunting dogs, the sighthounds, greyhound-like. The Spitz dogs, which seem to be a sort of natural step away from wolves. And then you also have specific breeds that have in the past couple hundred years been isolated one from the other. And I'm thinking here especially of the terrier breeds, right? If you went back 300 years and you were in England and you wanted a terrier dog, you'd get a kind of this sized, probably short-haired little thing. You wouldn't get a Scottie, a West Highland White, a Cairn Terrier. You wouldn't have all these different looks, right? A Staffordshire Terrier. But in the 19th century in particular, 18th and 19th century, folks got the idea, actually it was the rise of the middle class that allowed people to take up hobbies, right? A lot more people were able to take up hobbies. And they started, one of the things they started doing was, on the one hand, collecting botanical specimens, breeding flowers, things like that. And on the other hand, animals. Fancy pigeon breeding was all the rage. I don't know if you've ever seen a fantail pigeon. It looks like a little white peacock, right? Lots of weird things that the pigeons came up with. And Darwin looked at these things to see, again, the limits of variation and also the extent of variation that could be chosen from. But anyway, people started saying, okay, well, the Scottie Terrier, that comes from this part. The West Highland White Terrier comes from this. And so what might have been dogs occurring in the same litters were then isolated out and bred just for that particular body style and look. Right? And I think the terriers are the biggest example of this, because the breeds that we have are only like 100, 150 years old. But they've been very successful in creating that type. If I had more time, I'd show you a bunch of pictures. If you go to a dog show, the terriers are very diverse, but it's all arisen in the past couple hundred years, basically. And breeders maintain that by not outcrossing, right? So there are a lot of dogs sort of in the middle as well. So some of the sheepdogs are much older. Some of the lapdogs are much older, like the Italian Greyhound that I showed, or the Cavalier King Charles, or if you've seen, or English Toy Spaniel. You'll see these in paintings going back. And it's a slightly brachycephalic spaniel is what it is. So breeds have sort of different depth, but a lot of them have been isolated one from the other in the past 500 years. And that's why they can sort out so nicely on the genetics.
My question is, well, actually, I have two. Disclaimer, I'm a dog lover, and I have a dog who's a therapy dog. So I would love to think that dogs can read human emotions, and we all have stories that we can tell, and the dog who sat by the poet's grave for God knows how long. But empirically, is there any evidence?
Well, I don't know of a study that has, it's hard to say, how would you set up that experiment, right? How would you get at it? And it's very difficult because even in things like chimpanzees that are not living with us, even though they're our relatives, I have a friend that does experiments with chimpanzees trying to figure out if they have what's called a theory of mind. Right. When a chimpanzee responds to what another chimpanzee is doing, is it because, as we do, we think, oh, that person's feeling something, or that person can see over here, right? Is the chimpanzee doing that as well?
Is it a myth or is it true that crossbreeds are healthier than pedigrees? Is that always true, or it depends on the breeder?
There are data on that. People have this idea of hybrid vigor, right? If you have a corn crop in a field and it's growing pretty well, and this one over here is growing pretty well, you put them together, you cross them, you get corn that grows better in both places, right? Hybrid vigor. But when you think about that, you're only selecting for one thing, basically, the height of the plant and the amount it produces. If you have cattle and you have a good milk breed and another one, you might be able to cross them and get something that produces milk really well, right? But you're only really looking for one trait. When you're looking for a bunch of traits, for example, with a dog that you expect to live into its teens and you want it to be healthy, there's a whole bunch of things you're selecting for at once. So it gets really complicated. What the data show are that mutts, right, mixed breed dogs, are no healthier whatsoever than purebred dogs. The opposite may be true. Right. The difference is that purebred dogs have people that care about them. I mean, not the people that care about their mutts, but they care about the lineage, right? And so they keep track of it. They keep pedigrees. They write down what diseases each dog had, what good traits it had, try to breed for those, try to minimize the others. And they've been fairly successful. Right? And so when you have a breed club, for example, that's able to record all that stuff and then hand it over to a geneticist, and there have been a lot of success stories in this of finding, the particular disease genes and being able to then have a commercial test where I could now, if I bred Irish setters, take a test, like $100 from Optogen, test the dogs. It would tell me if my dog was a carrier of an important eye disease. And if you had two carriers, just don't cross those two. It's not that you have to eliminate every dog that's a carrier. Just do it wisely, and eventually, generation by generation, you can get rid of it without having any health problems. So, whereas people that have mutts, they tend to be isolated cases. We had looked at this slide, multiple events. We'd looked at the Cro-Magnon people. We've had some questions. Oh yeah, you didn't get to, this is one of my dogs. He's actually the top winning Pyrenean Shepherd of all time in the US. So anyway, I had mentioned that there was a wave of migration, right? This is of people primarily, right? Coming from the Levant, the Near East, spreading out into Europe. You can see genetically now, there's a fellow named Cavalli Sforza who's been running a huge project trying to figure out who came from where, right? If you're in a particular Italian village, where your ancestors came, where other ancestors came from, genetically. And it has been pretty successful, at least successful at convincing people that he knows various waves of migration. Right, and interactions. So very interesting data. And it suggests that a lot of people came out of the Near East, and then they intermarried in different parts of Europe, but that the population in Europe today is heavily influenced by that. This is when they brought sheep and goats with them. They had domesticated sheep and goats in the Middle East. They came with them to Europe, and you get the first sheep and goats around 6,000 years. And they brought dogs. Right. And so it is thought, and the sort of default understanding of the geneticists when they do these studies, is that all dog breeds in Europe are descended from the group of dogs that came out of the Near East, right, around 6,000 BC. There's no genetic evidence that they were mixed in with anything else. There is genetic evidence that the humans intermarried. So there's that's fairly convincing, I think. So now we get to the speculative part. These are the dogs that I breed. They're both from the Pyrenees Mountains. This is the Great Pyrenees. It's a very large dog, 100 pounds and more. They were bred to live with flocks of sheep and protect them from predators. So this big white dog will be in and among the sheep. And in the Pyrenees Mountains, they have these big, ugly sheep with Roman noses. They're about the same size as the dog, right? And it mixes right in there. You wouldn't even know it was there. But if a wolf comes, or a bear, the dog runs out in front of the flock, stands up very large, right? And just sort of predator to predator, right? Canine or carnivore to carnivore, says, you know, I'm here, you go somewhere else, right? And so it makes it harder for them to prey on sheep than on ibex or whatever else is available for the bears, the wolves, etc. And this has been phenomenally successful. And you find these big white dogs not only in the Pyrenees, but different breeds of them throughout Europe. This is seems to be another one of the types that you'll see. And you can see evidence of this type, this style, going back even perhaps to Assyria, it looks quite the same. So that's the Great Pyrenees. It lives with the sheep. It spends most of its time laying around, looking at the sheep, peeing on stuff, right, like dogs do. But you think, okay, dogs do that. It's sending a message, right? It's telling the wolf, he doesn't have to be right there, right, staring at the wolf in the eye. They can smell. It's a language that means they don't have to fight, right? It's a way of not fighting. And barking to the four directions, right, this sort of thing. It just, you want to announce that it's not going to work here. You don't want to have to take out every single wolf. That's not going to work, right? In the days before antibiotics, one puncture wound and your dog was gone, right, that got infected. Right. So they have a whole slew of behaviors, a whole repertoire of different behaviors to avoid fighting. But they will if they have to. And when they do, actually, it's kind of an interesting thing. They have this big ruff on them, right? And sometimes the folks in the Pyrenees would put these metal spiked collars on them. So if the wolf goes for the dog, he goes for the throat like this, right? He's not going to get it between the ruff and the spiked collar if he has one. But the Pyr, as they're called, Great Pyrenees, leans around and puts his teeth right in the back at the base of the skull and just crunches in. So it's interesting, again, the sort of stereotyped behaviors, because that's the sort of thing that could be selected for, even if rarely, it really matters when it happens. So again, all kinds of ways that these interact with elements of evolutionary theory that have nothing to do specifically with dogs. This is the small Pyrenean shepherd. It comes in two varieties. This is the cute variety, the rough-faced. The others are more plain. They're called the smooth-faced. And it's quite a bit smaller. In other places where you have herding dogs, they're not as small as this. And so you can realize in this case that a shepherd's not going to feed anything more than he absolutely has to. If he can get by with a little dog that can herd 1,000 sheep, he's going to do that one, right? And if you've got the big dog to protect, then the little dog doesn't have to be very big. It's only in places where you don't have a big livestock guardian dog that you get bigger shepherd dogs like German shepherds and you know, Belgian sheepdogs and things like that. So those are my guys. We don't have DNA data on them. There's a little bit on the Great Pyr, but they're not part of that starburst chart that I showed you, and there's nothing, virtually nothing, on the Pyrenean shepherd. Right? It's a little dog that's been pretty much overlooked, very isolated in the Pyrenees. You can't miss the big dogs, but the little ones, it's easy to overlook. This is the rarer variety of Pyrenean shepherd, the smooth-faced one. Doesn't have all the cute, fluffy hair. And it's got some interesting traits. I met a fellow once, an old guy, and he said, well, the smooth-faced Pyrenean shepherd is the original dog of the Cro-Magnon people. And I'm like, yeah, right, you know, fine. Okay. But a few things in the recent literature from Cavalli-Schwartz's project, from various things, have made me think, well, you know, why not think about this? Why not try this out? And this is what I've been kind of thinking about the past 6 months or so, of what if it, you know, were a case? So we're going to give it a try. The smooth-faced Pyrenean shepherd is an oddity in many ways, right? So it has unusual body proportions. That rough-faced dog that I showed you, the little shaggy one, is longer than it is tall, right? This variety is more square, and they're born in the same litters. If you have, yeah, they're born in the same litters. So if you have a rough-faced dog that produces a smooth-faced puppy, all the rough-faced puppies in the litter will be long, will be horizontal rectangle sort of look, and all the smooth-faced dogs will be square. And it happens generation after generation. In no other breed do you get the sort of changes like that. You'll get some breeds that have smooth, there's smooth collies and rough collies can be born in the same litters. Quite a number of breeds where you get a coat difference. Most dramatically, powder puff Chinese crested versus hairless Chinese crested. But it's really just the coat, the teeth a little bit in that case, but not the overall proportions of the dog. You get that in this breed. That's pretty weird. And the judges can't stand it. When I do judges seminars, they're pulling out their hair. The smooth-faced dogs, and this is true of the rough-faced as well, but more often in the smooth-faced, you have a natural bobtail. And the dog that I have up here has a natural bobtail. It was born with a short tail. Right? This is a dominant trait. Okay. The other, huh? That is this very dog, getting her grand championship in the picture there.
Wow.
They also have this merle coat color, which is kind of unusual. Yes, other breeds have it, and other breeds do have natural bobtails, some of them. But here's a dog with this constellation of characteristics that's really odd. Okay. Now, this dog and also the rough-faced ones as well have what's described often as feral behavior, right? These are not friendly little dogs that run up to you in the street and say hi and let's play ball and this sort of thing. They like their family. They're not necessarily interested in strangers. My husband says they're as warm and welcoming as the traditional French peasant. They are hypersensitive to their owners' moods, postures, behaviors. They really read people closely. I mean, all dogs do this to an amazing extent. These dogs, it's hard because they're constantly learning. So you're constantly training, but you don't realize you're doing that. Every little thing you do gets translated, and then you're wondering, why did that dog do that? And if you start thinking about, oh, because I did this and this instead of this, or the dog will walk into the room and you've moved in fact, the other day, I had taken a pumice stone and set it on the edge of the bathtub, right? And a puppy, 7-week-old puppy, walks into the room, looks at that thing, that was not there this morning, very suspicious of the pumice stone, right? You might have that from another dog, but it's very common in this breed. So they're real fine-tuned, high-strung, right? As I say, highly suspicious of strangers. It takes a great deal of socialization for this dog to be friendly to people. It's not impossible. I do it regularly, but far more than any other breed. And similar to how well they read you, they read livestock, right? It's remarkable the way they do. They also have some interesting styles in herding, right? So they tend to use their teeth a little bit more. They're not like the nice, beautiful style of a border collie. They're real rough and tumble, catch as catch can sort of thing. So anyway, thinking about that dog in the context of the Cro-Magnons, particularly in the Pyrenees, and Cro-Magnon is a site just to the north of the Pyrenees, right? They used these blades, these stone tools. These are Aurignacian, right? And Aurignac is in the Pyrenees, right? They had these Venus figurines. Now, Cro-Magnon folks across Europe did have them. There's a lot of them in the Pyrenees, and they're particularly symmetrical, right? These are really, a lot of thought went into producing these things. This particular one is from the Pyrenees. And a lot of cave art. Most of the cave art that you'll hear of comes from the Pyrenees, and I think it's not just a matter of preservational bias. They seem to have had a fascination with color and movement and form and animals. Right? And it's interesting to me, some genetics work was recently done. This is the typical Lascaux bay horse that you tend to see in a lot of the paintings. This one from Peshmeral is spotted. And folks used to say, well, it's just self-expression. They're spotting this horse, right? Well, there are horses. You've seen Appaloosas that have spots. They're not very common. You certainly wouldn't expect it in a wild population of Przewalski horses or something. But they ran the DNA from some old bones, and they found this spotting pattern, and they found it in southwest France, in the Pyrenees in particular. Right? So the guy knew what he was doing, right? It was a spotted horse. And you can see here, right? Bay horses like that. That's a Przewalski horse, one of the few remaining wild horses. And this is an Appaloosa. There are also some European breeds like Knopstruppers who have this color pattern. It's not just here. So maybe they thought it was pretty, At that time, everyone knows horses weren't domesticated, but there is some other evidence about horses. There's a jaw of a horse, a skull of a horse. It's been found, and the changes in the teeth suggest that it had been cribbing. It's a thing bored horses will crib. They'll grab the side of the stall and they'll start swallowing air. I don't know why they do it, but that's what they do. It seems to keep them occupied, right? So I'm not here to claim that the horses were domesticated at that time, but they might have been locked up, right? They might have been able to keep them in caves or things like that. Would certainly make hunting them easier, right? And the dogs might have had, if they had an independent domestication event that produced dogs that were helping them, that might have, it might have been working together that produced that situation, right? And if they liked the spotted horses for this aesthetic that they had, maybe they wouldn't lock them up, or maybe they wouldn't eat them, wouldn't hunt them, whatever. You could see how there could be an impact, a selective impact from people, far less than what you would want to call domestication, but an impact, right? So, as I mentioned, the Pyrenean shepherd also has an unusual spotted coat color. It is not homologous genetically to the horse color, but it's interesting and it's spotted. As I mentioned, it's a dominant trait, right? If you randomly breed a group of dogs, even if it's 1,000 dogs, pretty fast, a dominant trait is going to disappear because you have to have it in order to have that trait, right? If by chance you have, a litter of puppies that don't have it, it's gone. You're not going to get it back, right? So populations tend to get rid of dominant traits fairly easily. And particularly something that's as unusual as this, you could really see where it would disappear. This gene has been sequenced. I sent a bunch of DNA samples off to Keith Murphy's lab in Texas A&M a few years ago, and he had a grad student working on it, got DNA from a number of other breeds that have merles in them, and it's identical. This is a recent mutation that has then spread throughout a few breeds. It's not very common, right? Lithos and engravings suggest that this coat color pattern was found in Pyrenean shepherds 300 years ago. There is nothing to indicate that the merle pattern was found in other breeds that now have it before about the 1920s. So that's suggestive to me that it may have originated in the Pyrenees. Right, and then been brought home by perhaps tourists, because the British had a thing of going to the Pyrenees in the 1800s, and they may well have brought it back and bred it into the collies and shelties. Again, the natural bobtail trait, also a dominant. And it's interesting here, similarly, the genetics have been done. It is a one allele trait that produces the dominant form. It's all or nothing, okay? In the Pyrenees, the shepherds cut the tails off the dogs, just as they do the sheep, for sanitary reasons. And you could see how this would be selected for to maintain that dominant trait. So, is the Pyrenean shepherd possibly descended from an independent domestication event among the Cro-Magnon folks 35,000 years ago? We need more data to say, but it's an interesting idea. If so, there ought to be a human counterpart, right? Dogs they aren't domesticated in a vacuum. Are there people out there that are also descended? And you may have already thought of the Basques in the Pyrenees, right? And I grew up thinking, hearing that they were unique, they had language, but we didn't really have the genetics on it. The genetics is beginning to come in, and it looks like they're pretty unique. We've always known about the Rh factor, right? And that does produce, they're almost all Rh negative, which means that if a woman produces a child with somebody who's Rh positive, the first one might be okay, but after that they're not likely to survive. So there's an immediate dip in reproductive success between the groups. Could they be a relict population, right, of Cro-Magnons? The language, it's utterly unique. It's not just, that's an idea that just doesn't go away. It's very, very interesting. And as I said, the genetics, unique. The culture is quite isolated. They have a lot of rituals which are pretty different. Why not the dogs? Thank you very much.